The manager called. Serafina, what on earth are you doing with that filth? You're on the clock. Serafina. He's starving, sir.
Please, eat this.
He hasn't moved in hours. Manager. He's a ghost, nothing. You can barely afford your own bus fare, yet you're giving away your dinner. Get inside before I fire you. Flashback. 10 years ago, the incident. Serafina. Please, sir. You need to eat. Take this. Killian in rags, voice raspy. I have nothing to give you back. The world. It took everything. Serafina. I don't want anything. I worked double shifts for a week to buy this meal, but you need it more. Take it. And take this scarf. The wind is biting. Killian. Why? No one looks at me. Why are you helping a dead man? Serafina. Because you aren't dead yet. Promise me one thing. Don't let the world turn your heart into stone. Survive. Killian. I'll remember. One day, I will find you and repay this warmth. Serafina. Just stay alive. That's enough payment. Hard smash cut. Present-day corporate office. Chaos. Assistant. Miss Black, the Sterling Group just executed the warrant. They've frozen the restaurant's accounts and bought out the lease. We're being evicted in 30 minutes. Serafina. What? But we were caught up on payments. Julian Sterling, walking in arrogantly. Look at the mess you've made, Serafina. Trying to play business owner when you're just a waitress with a soft heart. I'm seizing the building. How does it feel to be as homeless as the trash you feed? 10 years had passed since that frozen night in the rain. But for Serafina Black, the grind of survival had never truly let up. She stood behind the counter of the Black Bean, her family's modest neighborhood bistro, wiping down the worn mahogany surface that her father had polished for 30 years. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee and her mother's signature spice blend, a sanctuary of warmth against the gray city outside. But the peace was shattered when the bell above the door chimed with a sharp, aggressive clang. Julian Sterling stepped inside, followed by a team of men in sharp, predatory suits. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like a man who already owned the air everyone else was breathing. He scanned the cozy interior with a look of pure disdain. His polished Italian leather shoes clicking loudly on the hardwood floor that Serafina had hand-scrubbed just hours before. It's charming in a pathetic sort of way, Julian drawled, running a gloved finger along a shelf of vintage cookbooks. He flicked a speck of dust away with a sneer. Serafina straightened her shoulders, her service uniform crisp despite the long shift. Mr. Sterling. I told your assistants on the phone. Our debt is being restructured. We are on schedule. Julian let out a cold, sharp laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He signaled to one of his associates, who slapped a thick legal folder onto the counter, right over the spot Serafina had just cleaned. Restructuring is for people with potential, Serafina. You're just a girl playing house in a neighborhood that's finally moving up in the world. We've purchased your outstanding notes from the bank. Every cent. And we aren't interested in your monthly installments. Serafina's heart skipped a beat, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. You can't do that. We have an agreement with the bank. The bank cares about liquidity, not loyalty, Julian countered, leaning over the counter until he was inches from her face. The scent of his expensive cologne felt suffocating. As of 9 o'clock this morning, the Sterling Group is your sole creditor. And we are calling in the full balance. Today. That's impossible. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars, she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain stoic. Julian's sister Victoria stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway, her designer heels clicking like a countdown. That's the point, darling. You're out of time. This bistro, this legacy of yours, it's an eyesore. It's sitting on prime real estate that belongs to people who actually matter. She slid a fountain pen across the counter toward Serafina's hand. Sign the voluntary eviction and debt transfer. If you go quietly, we might let you keep your father's old chairs. I won't sign my life away, Serafina said, her grip tightening on the rag in her hand. "This is my home. My parents built this from nothing." Julian's expression shifted from smugness to a dark, jagged cruelty. He slammed his hand onto the legal papers, the sound echoing through the empty bistro. "A girl like you doesn't belong in this neighborhood, Serafina. You're a waitress with delusions of grandeur. Look at you. You're still wearing a name tag while I'm deciding the fate of this entire block. Sign the eviction or we'll take it by force. We'll have the marshals here by sunset, tossing your mother's china into the gutter. Is that the memory you want to keep?" The weight of the Sterling Empire felt like a physical mountain pressing down on the small room. Serafina looked at the pen, then at the cruel, expectant faces of the siblings. She thought of the man she had fed a decade ago, wondering if he had ever faced a monster he couldn't beat. She felt the same lethal stakes of that rainy night closing in, but this time there was no one to catch her. "You have 1 hour," Julian whispered, his voice a silky threat. "After that, we don't just take the building. We ruin you." They turned and walked out, leaving the door swinging in the wind. Serafina stood alone in the silence of her failing sanctuary, the shadow of the Sterling trap finally snapping shut. The grand ivory ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk, clinking crystal, and the kind of laughter that sounded like breaking glass. Serafina stood at the edge of the velvet-draped entrance, her breath hitching in her chest. She wasn't dressed in a gown of lace or satin. She wore her only clean service uniform, a simple black dress and a white apron, the fabric stiff with starch and pride. To the elite circling the room, she was invisible, a ghost in a palace of gold. To the Sterlings, she was a target. She spotted Julian and Victoria at the center of a gilded circle, surrounded by the city's most influential power brokers. Taking a steadying breath, Serafina moved forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every step felt like walking through deep water, the judgmental gazes of the wealthy stinging her skin like needles. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice small but steady as she reached the perimeter of their circle. "Please, I'm asking for a week. Just 7 days to find an investor." The conversation around the table died instantly. Victoria Sterling turned, her diamond necklace catching the light with a cold, blinding flash. She looked Serafina up and down, a slow, cruel smirk spreading across her perfectly painted lips. "Julian, look," Victoria cooed, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "The help has forgotten which door to use. Did you lose your way to the kitchen, Serafina? Or are you here to take our drink orders?" A ripple of snickering traveled through the crowd. Julian leaned back, swirling a glass of deep, blood-red Cabernet. "I told you, Serafina, you don't belong here. This is a place for people who build empires, not people who serve coffee to them." "I am a business owner," Serafina countered, her chin lifting. "My family has served this city for 30 years. I am asking for the professional courtesy of a grace period." "Courtesy is for equals," Julian snapped, his face hardening. "You come here, dressed like a maid, smelling of cheap grease and desperation, and expect to stand among us?" He stood up, the movement slow and predatory. He took a step toward her, the red wine in his glass sloshing dangerously. "You want to know what your legacy is worth to me? It's less than the floor wax on these tiles." As he spoke, he tilted his hand. It was a slow, deliberate motion, a calculated execution. The dark red wine poured from the crystal glass, a staining torrent that splashed across Serafina's white apron and soaked into the dark fabric of her uniform. The cold liquid seeped through to her skin, making her flinch, but she refused to look down. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Julian mocked, though his eyes remained sharp and vicious. "But then again, red suits you. It matches the color of your bank account." Victoria burst into a high, melodic laugh, and the rest of the room joined in. The humiliation was a physical weight, a suffocating heat that rose to Serafina's cheeks. She stood at the center of the ballroom, a stained and low-status waitress being mocked by the gods of high society. "Go home, Serafina," Victoria whispered, leaning in close so only she could hear the venom. Before we have security, toss you out like the trash you are. A girl like you was born to serve. Don't ever forget your place again. Serafina turned, her eyes burning with unshed tears but her back straight. She walked through the hall of mocking faces, the red wine dripping onto the marble floor like drops of blood. She felt the lethal stakes of her world more clearly than ever, unaware that from the shadows of the upper balcony, a pair of dark, intense eyes had seen everything. The cold night air bit at Serafina's skin as she stumbled out of the ballroom, the red wine on her uniform beginning to chill. The laughter of the Sterlings still echoed in her ears, a jagged sound that made her vision blur with stinging tears. She reached the curb, her breath hitching as she looked at her trembling hands. The lethal stakes of her world had never felt more real. She was a woman whose kindness had been weaponized against her, left to stand in the shadows while the monsters celebrated in the light. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the street was cut by the low, predatory hum of an engine. A fleet of black vehicles rounded the corner, moving with a synchronized military precision that commanded the very pavement beneath them. At the center of the motorcade was a long, obsidian-black luxury sedan with windows so dark they seemed to swallow the surrounding streetlights. It pulled to a smooth, silent halt just yards from where Serafina stood. Before the car had even fully stopped, 4 men in charcoal gray suits stepped out from the lead and trailing vehicles. They moved with a silent, disciplined lethality, forming a protective perimeter that froze the world in its tracks. One of them stepped toward the rear door of the sedan, his gloved hand clicking the handle open with a sharp, echoing snap. A man stepped out into the damp night air. He was tall, his silhouette cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the faint glow of the city skyline. He wore a bespoke overcoat of midnight wool that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, every inch of his attire screaming of a billionaire mafia boss status. This was Killian Vane, a man whose name was whispered in boardroom backrooms and dark alleys alike, the ghost who had built an empire from the ashes of a forgotten life. He didn't move immediately toward the ballroom. Instead, he stood by the open door, his dark, piercing eyes fixed on the small, shivering figure across the street. He watched as Serafina tried to scrub at the wine stain on her apron, her shoulders shaking with a quiet, exhausted sob. To anyone else, she was just a ruined waitress. To him, she was the only light he had ever known. Killian reached into the inner pocket of his coat. His fingers brushed against something that didn't belong in a world of billions and blood. A tattered, faded scarf, its edges frayed by time but its warmth still vivid in his memory. He clutched the fabric tightly, his knuckles whitening. 10 years ago, he had been a starving man in the dirt, invisible to a city that wanted him dead, until her kneeling figure had changed the trajectory of his universe. "Sir," one of the guards whispered, noticing his pause. "The Sterlings are expecting you. The acquisition meeting is set to begin." Killian didn't look at the guard. His gaze remained locked on Serafina as she turned to walk away, her head bowed in defeat. The status flip was complete in his mind. The man she had saved was now the only man who could save her. A cold, jagged smile touched his lips, the kind of smile that preceded a storm. "Let them wait," Killian said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that held the weight of an executioner's blade. "I have a 10-year debt to settle, and I intend to pay it back with interest." He watched her disappear around the corner before finally turning toward the grand ivory ballroom. The Sterlings thought they were celebrating a victory, but they had no idea that the ghost they had invited inside was about to burn their gilded world to the ground for the sake of a stained white apron and an old, tattered scarf. The morning sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of the bistro's upstairs boardroom, but it brought no warmth to the room. Serafina sat at the head of the heavy oak table, the same table where she used to do her homework while her father went over the books. Now, the surface was covered in cold, white legal documents and eviction notices. Across from her, Julian and Victoria Sterling leaned back in their leather chairs, their expressions radiating a bored, predatory confidence. "The hour is up, Serafina," Victoria said, checking a gold watch encrusted with diamonds. "And yet, I don't see an investor. I don't see a miracle." All I see is a girl who's run out of places to hide. Julian reached forward, sliding a single sheet of paper toward her. It was the formal surrender of the property, including a clause that prohibited her from opening another business within the city limits for 10 years. We're being generous. If you sign this now, we'll waive the legal fees we've accrued while chasing you. If you don't, we'll start the foreclosure on your mother's house by noon. Serafina felt the walls closing in. Every breath felt like a struggle against an invisible weight. She looked at the signature line, her hand trembling as she reached for the pen. The lethal stakes were no longer a distant threat. They were here, in the form of a black ink line that would erase 30 years of her family's blood, sweat, and tears. "Please," Serafina whispered, her voice cracking. "My mother lives in that house. It's all she has left of my father." "Then you should have thought about her before you decided to play hero," Julian snapped, his voice dropping to a low, jagged growl. "You wasted your life feeding beggars and worrying about the community, while we were building an empire. This is the natural order of things, Serafina. The weak are consumed to make room for the strong." Victoria leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a sick sense of triumph. "You're done, Serafina. You have nothing left. No money, no bistro, and very soon no home. Hand over the keys and the signed papers. Maybe if you're lucky, we'll hire you to clean the lobby of the luxury hotel we're building on this spot." The silence that followed was suffocating. Serafina looked at the heavy brass keys to the bistro sitting on the table, the keys her father had handed her with a proud smile on her 21st birthday. Her fingers brushed the metal, cold and final. The socialite villains were smiling now, a pair of vultures waiting for the final breath. "Sign it," Julian commanded, his voice echoing in the small room. Serafina's hand closed around the pen. She felt the salt of a tear hit her cheek, the taste of total defeat. She was a heroic outcast, whose luck had finally run out, a woman who had given her last meal to a stranger 10 years ago and was now being starved out by the world she tried to help. She lowered the pen to the paper, the tip touching the line. Outside, the distant sound of a motorcade began to grow louder, a deep, rhythmic rumble that shook the glass in the windows. But in the boardroom, the only sound was the scratching of a pen that was about to end a legacy. "I'm waiting," Victoria prompted, her smile widening. "Give us what belongs to us." Serafina closed her eyes, the pen beginning to move, when suddenly the heavy double doors of the boardroom were not just opened, they were thrown wide with a force that sent them crashing against the walls. The status flip was about to begin, and the air in the room suddenly turned as cold as a grave. The crash of the double doors echoed like a gunshot, freezing Serafina's hand a fraction of an inch above the surrender papers. The aggressive confidence that had filled the room moments ago vanished, replaced by a sudden, bone-chilling stillness. A phalanx of men in charcoal suits stepped in first, their presence radiating a silent, disciplined lethality that made Julian and Victoria scramble to their feet. Then, the atmosphere shifted entirely as a single figure crossed the threshold. Killian Vane moved with the slow, effortless grace of a predator who already owned the territory he was walking into. His midnight wool overcoat caught the morning light, and his presence was so immense that the spacious boardroom suddenly felt cramped. The socialite villains, usually so quick with a sharp remark, stood paralyzed. They recognized the face from the covers of financial journals and the hushed warnings of their own legal counsel. This was the man who had swallowed 3 rival conglomerates in a single quarter, the ghost of the Vane Empire. "Mr. Vane," Julian stammered, his face draining of color until it matched the legal documents on the table. We weren't expecting you until the gala tonight. If we had known you were interested in this property." Killian didn't even turn his head. He ignored Julian as if the man were a flickering lamp, of no more consequence than the dust in the air. He didn't look at the expensive mahogany table or the panoramic view of the city he had conquered. His dark, piercing eyes were locked onto a single point, the woman sitting at the head of the table, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and a faint, flickering memory. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic click of Killian's boots on the hardwood. He walked past the Sterlings, who shrank back as he passed, their high-status arrogance evaporating in the face of true power. He reached the end of the table where Serafina sat, her stained uniform a stark contrast to his bespoke luxury. Then, the most powerful man in the city did something that caused Victoria to let out a strangled gasp of disbelief. Killian Vane didn't pull out a chair. He didn't offer a cold handshake. Instead, he lowered himself, his expensive trousers hitting the floor as he knelt in front of Serafina. It was a mirror image of a rainy night 10 years ago. A status flip, so profound it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. He looked up at her, his expression softening from the mask of a mafia boss to that of a man who had finally found his North Star. His eyes held an emotional intensity that bordered on reverence. "You told me the world hadn't forgotten me," Killian said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "I spent 3,650 days making sure I stayed alive just to tell you that I never forgot you." Serafina's breath hitched. The heroic outcast looked down at the man kneeling in the mud of her current life, and for the first time in 10 years, the freezing cold of the Sterling trap began to thaw. She looked at his face, searching beneath the power and the wealth, and found the ghost of the starving man who had once promised to return the warmth. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. Killian reached out, not to take the pen from her hand, but to cover it with his own, stopping the signature that would have ended her legacy. "The pen is for them to sign their surrender, Serafina. Not yours." The air in the room remained cold, but for the first time, Serafina wasn't the one shivering. The Sterlings watched in silent horror, realizing that the woman they had treated as trash was the only person in the world who held the heart of the ghost. The silence in the boardroom was no longer heavy. It was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed the frantic breathing of the Sterling siblings. Serafina looked down at the hand covering hers. It was a powerful hand, the skin smooth but the grip possessing an immovable strength. She looked back up at the man kneeling before her, her mind racing through 1,000 blurred memories of rainy nights and double shifts. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" Killian's gaze didn't waver. The cold, lethal mask he wore for the rest of the world remained shattered only for her. "The world sees a man who built an empire out of shadows," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a decade of longing. "But 10 years ago the world saw nothing at all. I was a ghost in the rain, starving on a sidewalk while people like them stepped over me like I was trash." Victoria Sterling let out a forced, high-pitched laugh, her hands trembling as she clutched her designer purse. "Mr. Vane, please. This is an absurd theatrical display. Whatever this waitress told you, she's a manipulator. She's losing her business because of her own incompetence." Killian's jaw tightened, a flash of jagged steel returning to his eyes, though he never looked away from Serafina. He reached into the deep pocket of his midnight wool coat and pulled out a bundle of fabric. It was faded, the once vibrant color washed out by years of wear and tears, its edges frayed into a delicate fringe. He draped the fabric over the mahogany table, right next to the eviction papers. It was her scarf, the one she had taken from her own neck 10 years ago because the man shivering in the mud looked like he was about to freeze to heart stop. Serafina's hand flew to her mouth. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She saw him then, not the billionaire in the bespoke suit, not the feared mafia boss, but the hollow-cheeked man with the dirt-smudged face who had looked at her with such desperate wonder when she handed him a bowl of noodles. "You," she breathed, the word a sob of recognition. "The man from the street. You fed a man who had no reason to live, Serafina," Killian said, his voice thick with an emotional intensity that made Julian Sterling stumble back a step. "You told me the world hadn't forgotten me. I spent 10 years making sure I never forgot you. Every dollar I made, every enemy I broke, every step I took out of that gutter, it was all to get back to this room, to make sure no one ever made you shiver again." He picked up the tattered scarf and gently wrapped it around her hand, the same hand that had almost signed away her life. The contrast was staggering, the billion-dollar tycoon kneeling on a dusty bistro floor, holding a piece of rag as if it were the crown jewels of a kingdom. "The status flip is complete, Julian," Killian said, finally turning his head to look at the Sterlings. His voice had gone from velvet to ice. "You thought you were trapping a helpless girl. You didn't realize you were touching the only thing in this world that belongs to me." Serafina looked from the scarf to Killian, the scarf of destiny, now a bridge between her past kindness and her current salvation. The fear that had suffocated her all morning was replaced by a strange, soaring sense of vindication. The man she had saved from the darkness had returned, and he had brought the dawn with him. The atmosphere in the room didn't just chill. It solidified into a tomb-like silence as Killian Vane stood up from his knee, his hand lingering protectively on Serafina's shoulder. He turned toward Julian and Victoria, and the status flip was no longer a metaphor. It was a financial execution. The Sterlings, who had spent the morning savoring their victory over a low-status waitress, now looked like mice cornered by a lion. "You were speaking about a natural order, Julian," Killian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky whisper that seemed to vibrate the glass in the windows. "You talked about the strong consuming the weak to make room for progress. I find myself in agreement with that philosophy for the very first time." Julian tried to straighten his silk tie, but his fingers were shaking so violently he nearly tore the fabric. "Mr. Vane, please. This is a misunderstanding. We were simply managing a distressed asset. We had no idea the girl was under your protection." "She isn't under my protection," Killian corrected, his eyes flashing with a jagged, lethal light. "She is the foundation of my existence. And you treated her like dust." He signaled to one of the charcoal-suited men standing by the door. "The reports." The assistant stepped forward and handed a sleek tablet to Julian. As the socialite scrolled through the data, his face went from pale to a sickly, translucent gray. "What is this?" Julian gasped, his voice cracking. "These are our offshore holdings, our private equity notes, our family's trust accounts." "I didn't just buy her debt, Julian," Killian said, stepping closer until he was looming over the desk, the billionaire Mafia Boss aura suffocating the room. "While you were busy spilling wine on a saint's uniform and mocking her poverty, my team was busy liquidating the Sterling legacy. I didn't just buy this building. I bought your debt. I bought your parents' estate. I bought the bank that holds your family's name. I bought your entire family's future." Victoria let out a sharp, hysterical sob. "You can't do that. That's our birthright. We are the Sterlings." "You were the Sterlings," Killian countered, his voice as cold as the rain Serafina had saved him from. "Now you are debtors. You are the nothing you accused her of being." He leaned down, placing his hands on the table and looking directly into Julian's hollow eyes. "The bistro is no longer for sale. The luxury hotel project is cancelled. And as for your position in the Sterling Group, you're fired. Your sister is fired. Your father is being served the bankruptcy papers as we speak." The socialite villains stood frozen, the reality of their lethal stakes finally hitting home. They had tried to take a single bistro, and in return the ghost had taken their entire world. "Get out," Killian commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, final sentence. "Leave the keys. Leave the papers. If I see either of you within a mile of this woman or this street again, I won't use a checkbook to settle the score. I'll use the methods that earned me the name you're so afraid of." Julian and Victoria didn't argue. They didn't beg. They simply turned and fled the room, their expensive shoes clicking frantically on the floor as they ran from the man who had just erased them. Killian turned back to Serafina, his expression instantly softening. The debt repaid was only the beginning, but for the first time in 10 years, the ledger of his heart felt like it was finally finding its balance. He looked at the tattered scarf and then at her, his savior, who was no longer a victim, but a queen in a world he had conquered for her. The sky over the city had finally broken, unleashing a torrential downpour that mirrored the freezing night 10 years ago. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was absolute ice. Julian and Victoria Sterling stood paralyzed, their faces twisted in a grotesque mask of shock and denial. The status flip was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a physical reality that was about to eject them from the world they thought they owned. Killian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply gestured to the 4 men standing at the door. Men who didn't look like standard security, but like the silent, lethal enforcement of a mafia empire. "The Sterlings are no longer authorized to be on this property," Killian stated, his eyes never leaving Serafina's face. "Remove them, and ensure they take nothing that doesn't belong to them, which, as of 5 minutes ago, is everything." "You can't do this," Victoria shrieked, her voice hitting a desperate, jagged pitch as a guard's hand closed firmly around her upper arm. She struggled, her designer heels skidding on the polished floor. "Do you know who our father is? We'll have you in court for the rest of your life. Your father is currently watching his legacy evaporate from a park bench," Killian countered, his tone flat and final. "And as for court, I own the building the judge sits in. Take them out." The guards didn't hesitate. They moved with a clinical, unyielding force. Julian, who had spent his morning mocking Serafina's low status, was now being hauled toward the door like a common trespasser. He grabbed at the doorframe, his expensive silk suit bunching and tearing under the guard's grip. "Wait. Let's talk. We can make a deal. The deal was settled 10 years ago." Killian's voice followed them down the hall, echoing through the bistro's corridors. The struggle moved from the boardroom to the main floor, past the tables and chairs where Serafina had worked herself to exhaustion. The socialite villains were dragged through the front doors and thrust out into the street. They landed hard on the wet pavement, the same mud and grime Serafina had knelt in now staining their bespoke clothing. The rain was relentless, soaking Victoria's hair until it clung to her face in matted strands and ruining Julian's leather shoes within seconds. They stood in the downpour, shivering and humiliated, as the heavy brass locks of the black bean clicked shut behind them. The lethal stakes had come full circle. They were now the invisible ones, the filth they had once accused others of being, left to stand in the rain while the world they had bullied moved on without them. Killian walked to the large front window, standing beside Serafina. He didn't look at the shivering figures on the sidewalk. He only looked at her. Through the glass, the Sterlings looked small, their power washed away by the storm. "They used to say the rain was a warning," Killian whispered, his hand resting once more on the tattered scarf still draped over her shoulders. "But tonight, it's just washing the street clean." Serafina watched the people who had tried to ruin her life scramble for cover, their arrogance replaced by a raw, soaking desperation. The tables turned was complete. The heroic outcast was inside the warmth, and the monsters were finally out in the cold. The storm had finally begun to break, leaving the city streets glistening like obsidian under the returning moonlight. Inside the bistro, the silence was no longer heavy with the threat of bankruptcy. It was light, filled with the scent of old wood and the lingering warmth of a debt finally acknowledged. Serafina stood at the center of the room her father had built, her hands still wrapped in the tattered scarf that had traveled through a decade of shadows to find its way home. Killian reached into the inner pocket of his coat once more, pulling out a heavy, gold-embossed leather folder. He didn't slide it across the table like a corporate predator. He held it out to her with a steady, reverent hand. "The Sterlings tried to tell you that you didn't belong in this neighborhood," Killian said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "They were right. You don't belong in a place that is beneath you." Serafina opened the folder, her eyes widening as she read the legal script. It wasn't just the deed to her family's bistro. It was the deed to the Diamond Plaza, the city's most prestigious property, the very ground the Sterlings had hoped to conquer. Attached to it was a document ensuring that the Black Bean would be the centerpiece of the new development, preserved forever as a landmark of integrity. "I can't take this, Killian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is a kingdom. I'm just a woman who gave you a bowl of noodles. You gave me a reason to become the man who could buy this kingdom," Killian countered. He stepped closer, his shadow falling protectively over her. You fed a man who had nothing, Serafina. You looked past the dirt and the rags and saw a human soul. Now the man who has everything belongs to you. This isn't a gift. It's a restoration. He gently took her hand, leading her out of the bistro and toward the waiting obsidian sedan. They drove in a silence that felt sacred, the city lights blurring past like fallen stars. The motorcade ascended to the pinnacle of the Vane Empire, the soaring glass tower that dominated the skyline. They stood on the observation deck of the top floor, the entire city spread out beneath them in a tapestry of gold and velvet. From this height, the struggles of the street seemed a world away, yet Serafina knew that the heartbeat of the city was found in the small acts of kindness that happened in its darkest corners. Killian stood beside her, his hand resting on the railing, the tattered scarf still draped over her arm. "Everything you see," he murmured. "I built it to show you that your belief in me wasn't wasted. The Sterlings wanted to take your legacy. I've made your legacy the foundation of mine." Serafina looked out over the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the clouds. The status flip was complete, the lethal stakes had been conquered, and the heroic outcast had finally found her throne. She leaned her head against Killian's shoulder, the warmth of the scarf and the man beside her a shield against the world. The rain had washed the streets clean, and as the sun rose over the Vane Empire, it illuminated a city where kindness was no longer a weakness, but the ultimate power. Since the restoration of the bistro and the acquisition of the Diamond Plaza marked a new beginning, the final stage of this story involves the permanent shift in the social hierarchy. Here is the conclusion of the narrative arc for Serafina Black and Killian Vane. Weeks after the fall of the Sterling family, the city was still buzzing with the news of the Vane takeover. But inside the newly renovated Diamond Plaza, the atmosphere was one of quiet, focused purpose. Killian didn't just give Serafina a building. He gave her the resources to turn her soft-heartedness into a legacy that would protect the city's most vulnerable, ensuring no one would ever have to beg in the rain again. He stood in his private office, the tattered scarf framed in glass on the wall behind his desk, a constant reminder of where he came from. He watched the digital ticker on his screen as the last of the Sterling assets were sold off to fund community kitchens and legal aid for wrongfully accused families, mirroring the help he once received. Serafina walked into the office, no longer in a stained service uniform, but in a tailored suit of deep emerald. She looked out at the city she once struggled to survive in, now seeing it as a place of infinite possibility. "You did it, Killian," she said softly, standing beside him at the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You didn't just repay a debt. You changed the ending for everyone." Killian turned to her, the ghost, finally at peace. "I didn't change it, Serafina. You did. On that night 10 years ago, you chose to see a man instead of a shadow. Everything I've built since then was just to be worthy of that choice." The story concludes not just with the status flip of a billionaire, but with a legacy restored, for a woman whose simple act of kindness became the most powerful currency in the city.